Ready, let's get people a moment to get in, and then we can get started. Alrighty. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Russian rulers presentation here today. My name is Roberto, and I am the moderator for this event. So if you are having any technical difficulties, please let me know, and I will also be giving vocal reminders for timing. And if you have any questions, please place them in the chat, and I will read them out during our Q&A session. We'll roughly have 20 minutes for presentation and 20 minutes for Q&A, maybe a bit longer for presentation, depending on how Mark feels. But in the end, we will work through them and go through all of that. So I will let Mark have the stage, and I will be in the background, here to assist. All right, you can have it at it, Mark.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen here, and we will begin. My topic today is something that I've been interested in for a long time. It's Russian paranoia. I've been hosting Russian Rulers History podcast, which we're now renaming to Russian History Retold for. It's going to be 15 years on April 30th. So I've been doing this since 2010. I majored in history at Queens College at the City University of New York, and I studied Russian history under the amazing Professor Paul Avrich. He was one of the most compelling history teachers I ever had. He's also the person who told me I would never teach any Russian history, since I only spoke what we call Kuchny Ruski, which is kitchen Russian, because I can find myself some food, water, drink, find my way to the bathroom in Russia. But he didn't think I would, and after 15 years of doing it, I think I did a little better than he expected. But if you're wondering, with my last name is Mark Schaus, where's this Russian come from? Because that's a German name. Well, my mother's side of the family was a part of the Russian Admiralty, and we've been able to trace it back to just about the time of Peter the Great. So I learned a lot about Russian history from that side of my family. My grandmother, my grandfather was pretty well known in Russia, very wealthy. He left early in 1917 from St. Petersburg because he saw the writing on the walls and went to Serbia and to Belgrade. And one of the reasons that I got into Russian history, because I think it's one of the most complex and misunderstood of all the major histories, looking at Rome, Greece, France, Great Britain, and those countries. But I thought the Russian history is really misunderstood by most people, especially in the West. And given the current global tensions, I think it's an important one to understand, so we understand why they're behaving the way they are, why they try to use deception as part of their propaganda to try to tell people, that they're going to bomb London if, we supply any more missiles to Ukraine and things of that nature. I want to go over why they're so paranoid. It's my whole idea here. And the big thing is Russia and the Soviet Union, as many of you know, has been invaded countless times over the past 1,200 years. It's led to a real paranoid behavior. And they use these false narratives to protect themselves from perceived enemies, whether they're actual or not. They will make up enemies that they think are not on their side, which presents a real problem for people trying to deal with them diplomatically. And there's also cultural differences between Russia and the West. This wasn't always the case. We'll show you why. They used to be very, very European in nature before the year 1240. And I think this is why there's a geopolitical vulnerability. They feel like they are vulnerable to attack and to invasion because this has happened so many times in their history. So the first one we have the invasion of the Varangians in 862. Now, according to something called the Primary Chronicles, which is some of our only real material we have about Russian history in this period, the Varangians, led by their chieftain Rurik, were invited to come and invade Novgorod. and then other parts of Russia by the Slavic people because they said they needed protection and there was too much lawlessness going around. Well, it's very likely that's not really the case, that they actually did invade and take control by force. This was a group of Vikings that were based in Sweden. They had been raiding all over Northern Europe and more Western Europe until they came into the area known as the land of the Rus. So this is where some of their real paranoia began, when you have these first invaders, but it wasn't a big one for them because it did change their society and gave them a lot of expansion of their land. So it was actually pretty good for them. But here's where it got dicey. The Mongol invasion started around the year 1237 and lasted on and off for about 5 years until they took complete control over the lands of the Rus. About the only area they didn't completely control was a place called Novgorod, which is up in the north because their land was a little swampy, tough for them to use their horses, which they relied upon to invade areas. And they were stopped right about the border of Russia with places like Hungary. And they would control this land until around the year 1480, although they still would raid into regions around Russia at the time. This is about a 240-year period where there was kind of a steel wall put between Russia and the rest of Europe. Before this point, and when the Principality of Kiev, on the Kievan Rus area, the sons and daughters of the grand princes, known as the Veliki Knyaz, were actually married to people like the King of France, King of Hungary. They were all over. Kiev was one of the largest cities in Europe. And about 100,000 people were living there until there were some invasions by the ones by the Mongols, but also from other Russian princes, to the point where Kiev didn't recover its population of 100,000 until about the year 1870. So about 630 years it took them to get back up to 100,000 people. Such was the devastation done in this area. This is a major, invasion, and it would isolate Europe during the periods of the Renaissance. So Europe would have a very dim view of its eastern neighbor. They'd view them more as Oriental than European. And it continues to this day. We have these opinions of Russia as being sort of backwards and not quite the same as the Western countries. Now, the next one, which is funny, this one actually occurred about the same time as the Mongol invasion. It was around between 1240 and 1242, and that was trying to invade Novgorod and Pskov in an attempt to convert them to Catholicism. Remember that Vladimir the Great had ordered the conversion of the pagans in this area in Kiev to Orthodoxy, following the Byzantine Empire's Orthodoxy. So the Teutonic Knights were coming over to convert them to Catholicism, and this was with the backing of Pope Gregory IX, which led to a long-running distrust of the Orthodox of the Catholic Church. And myself, having been baptized into the Russian Orthodox Church, I could tell you quite often that there would be some, disparaging comments made about the Catholic Church from priests and other followers of the Orthodox Church, and it started about this period of time. And we have this other one of Poland invading. Now, we're always familiar with the invasion of the Russians and the Soviets into Poland. Catherine the Great had annexed parts of Poland during her reign, but Poland actually had invaded Russia, and one of the periods was called the Time of Troubles. It's between 1609 and 1618. Poland invaded Russia and gained control of parts of it. They'd gotten all the way into Moscow, where some of these people known as the false Dimitris would try to run the country. These were people who claimed to have been the long-lost son of Tsar Ivan V, also known as Ivan the Terrible, which I don't like that term because his name in Russian is Ivan Grozny, and Grozny does not really translate into the terrible. It translates more into the awesome, kind of the awesome, terrible, fear type of person. So they did invade, and this would be part of the problem that Russia would have for a long period of time. They would want to conquer and partition parts of Poland in retaliation. One of the things that I've noted with a lot of the people of a Russian background, they hold grudges for an awful long time. My mother, who was born in Serbia, would always be upset with the Croatians, and I'm going, Mom, this goes back 400 years. I think you can kind of let it go, but they really couldn't. Once there was this historical invasion or some atrocity occurred, this would be part of their memory and long-term memory, and would cause them to act the way they do. And then we have the next one. Here's the AI version of Peter the Great. Uh, there was a lot of tension between Sweden under Charles XII, who's considered one of the great generals of his time, having defeated the Poles, having defeated the Danes and other countries. And he was just, he'd beaten Peter a number of times in a few battles. But Peter had this one unique quality, that when he lost something, he would learn from it. So they would start something called the Great Northern War. And Charles decided to invade Russia in 1708. He was met with one of the great defenses that Russia has, known as the Great Winters. And this was one of the more tremendously cold and brutal winters in 1708. Instead of trying to return back to Sweden and gather his forces again, Charles kept on invading because he thought, hey, I beat Peter before, I'll beat him again. Unfortunately for him, he lost in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava. It was a complete rout. Charles was forced to flee into the Ottoman Empire and was never able to really regain his magical military touch at that point after this battle. And the town of St. Petersburg is really interesting. It was built partly due to the need for a fort up there to protect its northern borders. If you want to pick a place to build a city, St. Petersburg probably would have been the worst selection you could have made. It was total swampland, and yet Peter decided, no, I needed something here. And tens of thousands of people died building this city. And I actually just finished an episode of on the history of St. Petersburg this past a couple of weeks ago. And I talk about how St. Petersburg was built, why it was built. I also did one on Moscow, and tomorrow I'll be uploading one on the city of Kyiv. So we next have one of the more famous invasions, and this is by Napoleon and the Grande Armée in 1812. And it was the largest invasion to date from the West. The invasion from the east of the Mongols was a bit bigger, but here we have about 660,000 troops that Napoleon mustered and crossed over to Russia to invade it and to take control. But we had a great general at the head who was replaced some of the other generals, Mikhail Kutuzov. And what he did is he just started battering the French army without going into full battles against them, just to pick and choose little spots and hit them, and then waited for, again, the great defensive system of Russia at the time, their winter, and of course, 1812 was another horrific winter. But this defeat really finally elevated Russia's standing in Europe. They rose up and people went, wow, this is not just an Oriental country anymore and backwards. They defeated one of the greatest generals in the history of mankind. They were able to beat Napoleon. So their status elevated for a brief while. And so we come up with the Crimean War. Because of their defeat in defeating the French, the other countries began to get a bit nervous about them, fearing what they called the Russian bear. So when Russia decided they were going to invade the Ottoman Empire because it was starting to, fall apart, it was looking like the ill part of Europe, the other countries like France, England, Sardinia to a lesser extent, decided to invade the Crimean Peninsula. England was particularly concerned because they were worried about their holdings in India and Afghanistan and thought that the Russians might threaten them there. And this picture here is something from the Crimean War, and it's the Valley of the Shadow of Death. So these are bodies just strewn over. In actuality, with this war, 70% of the people who died on both sides did not die in a battle. They died of disease like typhus, typhoid, and other communicable diseases. So most of the casualties were due to disease. The Russians should have been able to win here because it was close to their homeland, but because of poor transportation systems and very few rail lines, which were all over England, but not very good in Russia, they were not able to supply their men enough to win this war. So they lost pretty badly. So now they're paranoid again. They've been invaded for another time. And it really lowered the respect Europe had for Russia at this point. There was a lot of animosity, and this would come into play when Nicholas II was forced out of office in 1917. One of his relatives was King George of England, and they could not allow Nicholas to emigrate with his family into Great Britain because there was still this animosity against Russia amongst the people, and they thought it might hurt their efforts in World War I against the Germans, which cost the lives of the Romanov family. And we also have the other ones that most people don't understand. The Ottoman Empire and what's known as the Khanates were, when the Golden Horde, which was the Mongols, broke up, they broke up into a number of different Khanates, and three of the big ones were in Crimea, Astrakhan, and Kazan. And they were called the Tatars. And they, along with their allies, the Ottomans, would raid Russia constantly, year after year after year. And they would capture millions of people over these centuries to sell in the slave markets in places like Constantinople or Istanbul. So there was this fear. Not only have they been invaded from the east, numerous times from the west, and many times from the south. The only areas that they weren't invaded that often were from the actual north. There was nobody up there to do that. And then we have their final large invasion, which was the Nazi invasion. And this is Operation Barbarossa. And this would cause the deaths of millions upon millions of soldiers and civilians, so much so that Russia's male population would take decades to recover from the losses. There's still shortages of men, which is causing problems with having children and to increase their population to match, to help with their economy. And this would lead to the need for buffer states like those in the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, etc., with the Baltic states. So Russian paranoia was because of all these invasions that are happening. And we have something known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're trying to put missiles into Cuba to point at the United States. And this was in response to them knowing that there were missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. And one of the concessions that President Kennedy made to Khrushchev was to remove those missiles from Turkey. And Khrushchev, that was able to save some face, although he did lose his position quickly thereafter. But what he didn't know is that they were going to remove those missiles anyway, because they had very little use for them, because the Americans had intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could be fired from the United States into Russia, the Soviet Union, and they really didn't need them over there. And then finally, part of the Russian paranoia now is NATO. NATO was created to act as a safeguard in Europe against the Soviet Union. And so Russia has this really deep-seated paranoia and distrust of NATO because they're sitting on their borders. Poland, Sweden, Finland, all these countries, the Czech Republic, are joining NATO. And this is getting into the Russian paranoia. So now they're trying to do deception and threats and things like that to protect themselves from these perceived threats that they're getting from there. And this is part of the reason for the invasion of Ukraine. They wanted to develop this buffer state. What they didn't think was that Ukraine would fight back so hard and that the Western countries would, help them militarily. But that's not very surprising, and it leads more to their paranoia right now. And they're saber rattling against the West, saying that, threatening them. So, if you want to contact me, I've got well over 320 episodes already. I covered, Russia starting with their rulers. I thought this would be like a 2-year project back in 2010. but I cover all sorts of different parts of Russian history, and I'm finishing up my first book on it. Should be coming out a little later this year. And so now I want to open it up for questions.
That was actually perfect amount of time, Mark. So we did get a few questions in to the chat here. So first one is from Doug Ross. Where did the Swedes invade through during the Great Northern War?
They invaded through what is now Ukraine. So they came out from the western area, the kind of the northwest, through places like Smolensk in that area,
Mhm.
trying to point towards Moscow. But they were bogged down in the Ukrainian area because they used a scorched earth theory. They basically said, we're just not going to give you any supplies as you come through. They did this again with Napoleon and with Hitler. So this is, kind of a common thread. You have a long way to go to get to Moscow from, the European borders and, in Poland and that. So long uh,
Mhm.
trudging uh, pathway. And so it made it very difficult on anyone to do this. Hitler didn't even learn from the last two, where Sweden and the French, and the French had an overwhelming army, and they were unable to get there. So yeah, he did come from the west and kind of the northwest, but he had already taken over Poland, so that gave them the gateway to Russia.
Mhm. And then also from Doug, are winters in Western Russia so much worse than Sweden? I've never been to either, so I have no direct frame of reference.
Sweden has a little bit of a different kind of climate because it does have that very, very large coastline. So they can, it is still cold. It still has a lot of snow, but not quite as brutal as Russia. Now, Russia can get incredibly cold. It doesn't have that, Atlantic warming, you might say, from the ocean, which Sweden would have. Russia can have some particularly brutal winters. And the worst ones were 1708, 1812, and again at Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Three times when invading armies came through, and the Russian defense system, aka weather, saved them.
Any questions from anybody else? Feel free to write them in the chat. I'll be more than happy to tell them to Mark. But Mark, I actually do have a question for you.
Sure.
Um, in the face of this paranoia, how does it reflect more so on the people and their need to pick a strong ruler?
They feel like it's one of the only ways that they're going to be protected. They've gone through some weak ones. Nicholas II would be one of, great example. Boris Yeltsin was another one. Uh, their economy crashed. Here they are, they're democratically electing a president, and nothing goes right. So they really felt like the only time that they could ever get anything good for the country would be under a very strong leader. And one of the things after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, one really major mistake was done by the US government. They did not give any support to Russia economically. They just let them go. They helped the Czechs, they helped the Poles, they helped the Baltic states, helped everybody else that was in the Warsaw Pact, except for Russia. And Russia needed the help.
Hmm.
One of my childhood friends was the president of the first private bank in Russia when it, became free in 1991. And he said it was the wild, wild west at the time. He had to have four bodyguards with him at all times after if he left his work or that, and they all had to be taller than him because of snipers and things like that. The problem was he was about 6'10", so it was a bit difficult to find people. I think he had to just hire centers from the basketball league to be
Hmm.
around him. But he says it was a very dangerous time, and it didn't last there very very long. But it was just kind of a disaster as to how they just let this country go, and it led to what they have now. They're oligarchs, the people who were swept up and took all the shares of the companies that were, privatized and given to the Russian people. And we led to this, the people are paranoid. They want somebody strong to say, hey, you can't steal from the people except the people that are now in control steal from the people. But they're not told, and it's just all this Russian propaganda within their country that it's our fault. It's everybody else's fault. And to some extent it is.
hmm And then I have a question here from Diana in a Q&A box. Ukraine has more history not being part of Russia. Why does Putin keep claiming the two countries were always one?
Well, he wants to recover the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire. That's his big thing. It's like it's an ego trip, in my opinion. That under Catherine and Peter, Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire, and they want to return to that. They want to have that pride that this is ours. I mean, he even made the statement that Kiev was not an important city. It was the center and the beginnings of the Russian Empire. This is where it began. It was in Kiev in the ninth century. So they're making these false statements saying that that's we started in Moscow. Moscow was a little background, little hut-filled town when Kiev had 100,000 people, if Moscow even existed at that time. It wasn't until the 1300s that it actually became an important city. So I think it's just that they're trying to change the narrative, and that's part of their deception and their lies.
Awesome. And then we also have two questions by from Alan. Lots of other countries have been invaded a lot. Is Russia really that hard done by?
You look at the United States; it's been invaded once. Out the Aleutian Islands by the Japanese, and could say that Great Britain came in too, but those are minor. Russia's just had so many devastating invasions, so other countries have had some bad ones. Starting with the Mongols and going into the French, Swedes, the Nazis. They were talking tens of millions of people who have been murdered and killed in combat, or just civilians. So I think it's and they carry it to a great degree. They look at it and they really push it into their narrative that they've been invaded and they've been invaded badly, and nobody trusts them, and everybody's abandoned them. So it's just their own cultural paranoia.
Mhm. And then the follow-up question is, have they always used deception as a defensive mechanism?
Most of the time, their leaders would use deception and tell their people stories that really weren't happening. Stalin was a great example. During his early time, he persecuted the churches and would, have the priests and the bishops all, executed and left. But when the Germans invaded, all of a sudden, hey, we need the church, So he eased up all the restrictions on them and said, yeah, religion's fine. We could use them now. And telling people we were always like that before. We were just getting rid of some of the bad guys before. So it is a mechanism they've learned. I mean, Ivan the Terrible did it with his the Oprichnina and Oprichniki. They're kind of like secret police where he would go over and say, "Oh, I'm quitting. I'm not going to be czar anymore. You guys don't, love me," and walked
Mhm.
away. Which they also, "Oh my God, come back. We love you. We want you. We need you." So we'd use the deception there going back into the 15th century and 16th century. So this is just a pattern that they would use over time.
Absolutely. And that is something I've noticed where they would just I call it the Russian Stockholm syndrome, honestly. Where-
That's a great way of putting it. I like that. The Russian
Yeah,
South. Yep.
it's trademarked by Czar Power. Um, but we do have a question from Steve, and this is how does this paranoia affect the alliances Russia made over the years? It must have been tricky for them.
Yeah, it's like, who do we trust? When they had a lot of power during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, they forced these alliances, on with Poland, with the Baltic states, all those Warsaw Pact nations. They've had some very tricky relationships with the Chinese after Mao took over. There was some border tension, and there was a period of time in the 60s and 70s where there was a possibility that those two countries would go to war, and had to do with the Amur River and the border lines that were drawn up in the 1800s.
Mhm.
So their alliances have always been a little bit tricky as to who do I trust, and after they had, the great alliance with all the European countries beating Napoleon, all of a sudden they all turned on them. So it hasn't worked
Yeah.
as great as they thought.
Well, I even know like even before the Napoleonic Wars that Russia and Georgia allied, and then just to have the Russians come in and take them over. So there's a history of people trusting the Russians and then getting backstabbed as well through deception too. So that's a huge thing.
They take
Uh,
over the Caucasus,
mhm.
all of that whole region.
So this is a question from Elio. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Is the story about Potemkin villages true? A fake village painted brightly to impress Catherine the Great?
Yes and no. There were some on her trip along the rivers, but a number of the cities were actually built at that time.
Mhm.
Their outward face was a lot better than they were deep inside the town, but there were a number of villages. So I think it's a bit of a misleading part of history, and I don't want to call it fake history. Some of the other podcasts,
Ah.
but it is kind of some deception. There was
Mhm.
some deception by Grigory Potemkin. He couldn't build these cities overnight, but there was an attempt to build those, and that they were truly villages that still exist to this day. But most of them were real, but some, yes, they were fake.
Okay. And then another question with Diana, from Diana. What about Russia's relationship with China?
Right now, it's dicey.
Mhm.
A lot of foodstuffs were being exported from Ukraine to China, and there was great need for Ukrainian products to go to China. There's a mixed barrel here. What are we doing? They're buying a lot of their oil, which is one of the only ways that Russia gets any money anymore. They're selling it to India and to China. And I just read an article earlier this week where some of the ports are rejecting Russian oil imports. They've already, so in China and in India. So they're being squeezed right now, and the Chinese are looking at this saying, we want to take Taiwan, but look at what's going on to Russia. Maybe that's hurting our ability to invade Taiwan now because of the way the
Mhm.
Russians watched their invasion of Ukraine. So there's tensions going on there. They're trying to look like they're friendly, but it's economics too. If I'm not getting my sunflower oil from Ukraine because they were the largest producers of sunflower oil, uh, this is hurting China, so they're not too keen
Mhm.
on that one.
Yeah, and then like with the even the history of the Sino-Soviet split, and then going back all the way to the Mongols, there's always this huge issue between the two, where there's always because they're right on each other's borders, and for the longest time were it just
Yeah, and
no.
the Chinese do feel that the Russians took advantage of them when they were weakened by
Mhm.
the European, occupation of China, and so they took advantage and pushed their lines deeper south of the border. That China still believes that part of what's now Russian and Manchuria and places like that are
Mhm.
really their territory and not Russia's. And there's still a tension along those borderlines, and it almost started World War III. So, back in the 70s, they actually did have some pretty major skirmishes along
Mhm.
that border.
Any other questions? We have about 7 minutes left, maybe a bit less, six. Whatever it gets is 8 minus 15 minus 8. I don't
You
do
know,
math well.
I've got one good deception that I really want to always share,
Absolutely, go ahead.
and it's about the disappearance of Tsar Alexander the First in 1825.
Yeah.
Uh, they said that he died in Taganrog, and I have a belief that he really didn't. That he was so guilt ridden about his father's murder and his taking over that he became a monk known as where is this Fyodor Kuzmich. Now this man he became a monk, also known as the starets, and he would travel around Siberia. And here's a man who speaks multiple languages, traveling around Siberia, and his hands look like they're soft. He's about the same height, same look uh, as Alexander. And even Leo Tolstoy, before he died, was about to write a book where he believed that this really did truly happen. A lot of the scholastic historians will disagree with that,
Mhm.
but they also have to explain that when the Soviet Union opened up the tomb of Alexander, there was no body because they wanted to loot it as they had with some of the other previous czars. There was no body in the tomb. And so that's, and there was a great book, it's called Imperial Legend, The Mysterious Disappearance of Tsar Alexander I by Alexis Trubetskoy. And his family was
Mhm.
part of the Russian nobility. And he puts out a pretty compelling story about Alexander not dying in 1825. So there's another one of those little deception points in Russian history that, I always find compelling. I mean, whether it's true or not, you know, we're not 100% sure, but there is pretty strong evidence that Alexander did not die, and he moved on and he gave up his, the czarship first to his older brother Constantine, and then Constantine said no. That's when Nicholas I came in, and we have the first revolt of the Decembrists in 1825.
I love the Decemberists. They're a great band.
There you go.
And then fine, I think we have time for one or two more questions, depending on how long your answer is. This is from Alan. Does this paranoia imply that a peace deal with Ukraine that keeps Ukraine out of NATO will satisfy them and keep Eastern territories as long as they can portray it as victory? Of course. And he apologizes for this being a quickly typed question.
Yeah, I think that's Putin needs to save face, needs to say have some sort of victory. I wouldn't trust him for that anyway, because he's promised that he wasn't going to invade Ukraine when they turned over all their nuclear weapons to Russia after 1991, and said, "We will leave you alone. It's your land, your country. We'll never touch it." Well, how far did that go until he invaded Crimea? Then he invaded Ukraine. I mean, he's gonna do this. Ukrainian people right now are getting tired of the war. I mean, so are
Yeah.
the Russians. They're both sides are saying, "Hey, I don't know if we can continue this anymore." And both sides have lost a lot of people, but I think that would be the only way to satisfy them is to say we're not going to join NATO. But then the Ukrainians afterwards could just join NATO. It's like
Well, yeah, if the Russians lied to them, they can definitely just lie to the Russians and say, yeah, what are we
somebody's
gonna do now?
it's whether they're going to be able to allow the Russians to keep the Donbass region. To me, that's
Yeah.
one of the key areas because that's such a mineral-rich area.
Hmm.
The ores that are phenomenal, and it's really, really wealthy region of Ukraine, and that's primarily why they're trying to hold on to that, with their dear lives.
As I forget who said it, but it's the economy, stupid.
And
And
this one, it is a financial, boom
yeah,
to keep Donbass.
yes. So and plus, it's like it gives them more warm water ports in the Black Sea. So which for them has always been a big thing.
Right? They
So
always needed that one port, and
yeah,
they fought many a war over that,
yep. It's like we have a whole Crimean War about it.
which I covered extensively in my podcast.
Which absolutely. Well, that is all. If you want to keep hearing more from Mark, he will be in the round panel for Russian propaganda right after this. So we're going to post a link to get to that round panel in the lobby chat for the sessions. So please feel free to join us there and hear about, I forget what topics we're covering already.
I think we're going to cover a little bit about the Okhrana, the secret
Uh,
police,
yeah.
and some of the other propagandas that the Russians have permeated for a long time.
Oh, yes, we're gonna have a great fun. And you know what? With that, just feel free to ask questions immediately, because that's the more you can get us to talk about stuff, the better.
Oh, you betcha. Looking forward
All
to
right,
it.
all right, everyone. Thank you so much, and we will see you at the round table.